Hi, this is Lou Pulsfer to talk about something that not only applies to game design, but an awful lot of things in life. The forest and the trees. This is about the big picture. Most people know the expression, can't see the forest for the trees. That is, you get lost in details and fail to see the big picture. Well, in game design, it's usually the big picture that counts. Yet many designers, even very experienced designers, sometimes have this problem, getting bogged down in details at the expense of the quality of the game as a whole. Now let's look at this both from the player point of view and a designer point of view. Here's an example of both. You're making a game depicting the entire Pacific War, World War II. Does it make sense to ask players to manage minute details? For example, does it make sense to ask them to manage and determine the airplane loads, whether they were armed with weapons of one kind or another, when they were gassed up and so on, during an aircraft carrier battle such as Midway? Yes, the Japanese load decisions were very important in the battle. But can you ask players to keep track of such minute details at this scale? It becomes a grind rather than a game if you do that. Now let's break this down a little bit into the player perspective and then the designer perspective. If the player is playing the entire Pacific War, if I were playing the entire Pacific War, do you want to be forced to consider such minute details? Not me. I'm interested in strategy, not what is essentially tactics. If the players want such details, then they'd play a Battle of Midway game or a Battle of the Philippine Sea game or something like that, Battle of Coral Sea. Now, there may be a few grognards, quote unquote, who think grinding through details makes it all worthwhile somehow. But to me, games are supposed to be enjoyable, not grinds, not work. Designer perspective. Why would you go into these kinds of minute details that'll only punish the players or at best take a lot of time without being sufficiently important in the great scheme of things? What's really important, in other words? What are you trying to show in your game? Moreover, can you afford the time required to add these details and get them right? If you add the details and get them wrong, that's worse than not having them for sure. So, a World War II Pacific game just cannot model intelligence intercepts, which were vital in the Battle of Midway, or plane loads, vital in the Battle of Midway. It takes too much time, both for the player and the designer. And yet I understand there is a well-known computer World War II Pacific game by a well-known designer that does exactly this. Asks people to deal with minute details. Now, Occam's razor is a very good rule, which essentially amounts to, other things being equal, take the simpler explanation for a phenomenon. It's the kind of rule that conspiracy theorists never apply. But I have a better rule of thumb for game design. A designer knows he has achieved perfection not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. In other words, if it doesn't significantly contribute to the game, lose it, get rid of it. Even if it's your original idea or image when you started the game, if it's interfering with the game now, get rid of it. And if you apply that rule regularly, then sooner or later you're going to have to look at the forest, not the trees. Now, Occam's razor is an excellent guide, by the way, but it doesn't apply often in game design. Now, if you're designing a puzzle game, you might prefer complexity to simplicity. I still think that's a bad idea. I like elegant simplicity, and the best puzzles are simple puzzles. But it's actually easier to add things to a game than to remove them, even though games generally are better when the unnecessary things are removed. But in the case of a puzzle, you may be adding more trees to the forest in order to confuse the players. So whether you're designing a puzzle game or a more traditional sort of game makes a difference to how you look at things. Nonetheless, even if you're doing a puzzle, you need to try to keep the forest in mind as you wander through the trees that you're growing all over the place in your puzzle. As a freelance designer, I like to set aside designs for months. People who are working for a publishing company or a studio can't do that. I like to set them aside for months and then come back to them, because that helps me see the forest and it helps me recognize when there are trees that aren't needed.